the most popular and best-loved Victorian novelists, Anthony Trollope, and a special holiday treat, a short story by Vancouver writer Linda Svendsen. In his own day, Anthony Trollope was often seen as a bluff and brash boor. He was a club man. He loved fox hunting, saying once that the sport not only justified the death of a fox, but might even make expendable the life of a human being. Trollope was large and balding and loud and whiskery. He wore unmatched checks and ridiculous headgear. But his latest and most affectionate biographer, Victoria Glendenning, loves him. Glendenning has written what she calls an intimate biography, a life of the inner as well as the public man. And what she finds is a sensitive, knowing, compassionate writer, a writer at odds with his jolly, beefy image, which was a deliberate defense against the injuries of the world, because Trollope had a miserable childhood. The striking thing about Trollope enthusiasts, fans as well as his biographer, is their fierce loyalty for the man, and their determination to read as much of him as they can. They buy him by the shelf. Trollope was extraordinarily prolific, what Henry James unkindly referred to as his gross fertility. He wrote 47 novels, short stories, travel books, and biographies, so much that there would be log jams of manuscripts at his publishers. During one decade alone, the 1860s, when Trollope was working full-time for the post office, he rode to hounds 3 times a week from his house at Essex. He commuted to London by train. He wrote a commentary on Caesar, a book about America, a lot of journalism, and 19 novels. He was at his desk by 5:30 in the morning. He wrote 1,000 words an hour for 3 hours, a rate of 10 pages a day, before going off to work at the post office. There, he's credited with having invented the pillar box for mailing letters. When Trollope finally quit to write even more, he traveled extensively to Australia, Africa, and America. Anthony Trollope was 67 when he died in 1882. Victoria Glendenning is famous for her biographies of complex, eccentric women: Edith Sitwell, Rebecca West, Vita Sackville West, and Elizabeth Bowen. Trollope is her first biography of a man. I talked to Victoria Glendenning when she was in Toronto last fall for the International Authors Festival. There seems to be a terrific revival of interest in Trollope. Not only new biographies, but the establishment of a Trollope Society of London and New York, and they're publishing a uniform edition of the novels. There's been the placing of a memorial in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, even a televised series called Barchester Towers. Why do you think there's so much interest in Trollope?
I don't think it's a new interest in Trollope. I think it's just one that's come out of the closet. You see, Dickens has had a terrifically good innings. Charles Dickens is read in school. Everybody's told to read Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens is wonderful. Well, Trollope, to me, is more wonderful. And a lot of people have known that all along and have been reading him. And there's little sort of, not secret societies, actually, but people having a good time reading Trollope all over the English-speaking world, and there always have been ever since he was a very, very popular writer in his own day. And I think it's just now that people have got together and come out about this. I think part of the trouble was that he hadn't been taught in universities and in colleges. So I think he's kind of escaped all that academic criticism and is still as alive, his work is still as alive as it was when he wrote it.
Why do you think that happened? Did you speculate on why Dickens would, as you say, get the innings and Trollope would not?
I think Dickens was the most famous writer in the world in his day. I mean, he was more famous than Trollope. I think
but even later?
I think there's something very easy to appreciate in a way in Dickens, in that his good characters are so very good. You know, his pure young girls are so utterly pure and milky, in my opinion, and his villains are so totally villainous that it's kind of unsubtle and quite easy for kids to read in a kind of way because of this slightly caricature thing. I think Trollope is much more of a writer for grown-ups, if you like, in that he creates a whole world that you feel you keep having to remind yourself these are people in books, not in life, and that his characters, who are obviously the ones he approves of and likes, always have faults. And his very faulty, either very cruel or dishonest characters have their good points, which is much more how it is in real life. I mean, Trollope said he thought the worst words for the writer of fiction were hero and heroine, because there aren't any in the real world. And it's I know realism and naturalism are kind of empty words, but it is the truth, if you like, of Trollope's people that appeals to readers over hundreds of years.
It's interesting what you're saying about how it's sometimes hard to forget they're not real people, because you were telling the story.
Yeah, well, a friend of mine was sitting in a train in Britain and reading The Small House at Allington in a paperback edition, which is one of his very good novels. And a stranger, who she didn't know at all, leant over from the other side of the railway carriage and said to her, "Tell me, what do you really think about Johnny Eames?" Now, Johnny Eames is a young guy in this novel who loves hopelessly a young woman called Lily Dale and won't give it up and won't love anybody else, and sort of is like a kind of obsessive about wanting what he cannot have. And so they talked about this for a bit, and they talked about Lily Dale, and in some ways she was a very tiresome creation, and so on. And they talked about them very happily until the man got to his station and he got out. And another person who was in the carriage, who hadn't entered into this conversation, leant up to my friend and said, "How extraordinary, and how very pleasant for you both that you knew so many of the same people." And that story rings totally true, because that is how it is. It is as if the Trollope characters exist in the world somewhere, and we have met them, but they're not in the room at the moment, and we talk about them as if they were real people. It's like a virtual reality or an alternative world. And I think this is the huge pleasure of Trollope's fiction, especially as he carries on some characters through novel after novel, so that in a way it was like the very slow 19th century equivalent of a soap opera, and because it was rather slow, it takes a long time to bring out a book, a long time to publish a book, etc., to write a book. The readers grew older with the characters, as it were.
Victoria Glendenning, when you started your biography of Trollope, there hadn't been a life in almost 20 years. The field was clear, and suddenly there were not one, not two, but three others initiated by American academics, all men. How did you feel?
Well, I knew about the first one fairly early on, and it often happens that there is another book when you're writing a book, and so I took that on board with some difficulty. And then the next one, and then the next one. Then they began to come out, these books, when mine was still not finished. And it seemed like, like a curse. It seemed like I was doomed, and I was in despair. And I thought, even though I am a woman, I'm not an academic, mine's going to be different. It seemed like suicide. And I didn't know what to do until a friend said to me a wonderful thing. He said, "Think of them as warming the bed for you." And that's really how it was, in a kind of way. I mean, in a metaphorical way, you have to just imagine my marital bed, which is very, very large, the one I have, which is like a tennis court. And in it normally are me, my husband, the dog, and the two cats. And now there was me, my dog, the husband, the two cats, and these three notional American professors lying in line like sardines or anchovies. And that's how I kind of thought of it. But in a way, it was true, in a real sense, that they warmed the bed for me, in that I think the world was very ready to learn more about Trollope. When you know a bit about somebody, you want to know more, and you want to know more. And I don't think any of us have suffered in a way. It's just Trollope's decade, if you like.
Were you always confident that you could bring something fresh and original to Trollope?
I think partly. I mean, you could say it's partly by default, in that I'm not academic. I come to it very much as, I don't know what as, just as a person, an interested and excited person looking at her life. And as a reader. And also I think that gender comes into it a bit as it comes into everything. In that, I mean, I haven't read the three professors' books all through, I just looked at them nervously from a distance, but I am aware that I was far more interested, I think, than they were in the family relationships. You know, one thinks of great writer rather as a figure on a mountain in a vacuum, as you might say, but the network of family relationships, the influence of his mother, the shadow of his older brother, the deaths of his younger brothers, and then as he went on, the nieces and the sons, and the sort of spread of it, the web in which he lived interested me very much. I stopped seeing Trollope just on his own, as it were, and moved into his world, and I think that was nice for me, and I hope it's fun to read about.
Anthony Trollope's image, I think, is as the rather dull Victorian, decidedly middle brow, the favorite of the Prime Minister, John Major, which would seem to only reinforce that kind of middle brow appeal. And his books had fallen out of fashion. As you say, Dickens was more popular, and his books had fallen out of fashion even before his own death. Did you want to, not exactly rehabilitate him, since you're saying he was already popular, but just give him a better rep?
Not particularly. If I didn't I mean, when I came to him, I didn't know what I would feel when I'd been through all the material and read all his novels from number 1 to number 47. So I didn't come to it with a crusading spirit. I do think that there's a great unfairness when a writer is beloved by his readers, as Trollope is, to condemn him as middlebrow, because a lot of people like him, you know, as if a lot of people enjoy greatly a novelist, he must, by definition, be not such a good novelist as one whom only a very few people enjoy. Now, this seems to me a very peculiar kind of
snobbery,
bizarre
I guess.
Snobbery.
Yeah.
As far as John Major, the British Prime Minister, is concerned, I don't think he can have read him very hard. Because, in fact, Anthony Trollope is unbelievably rude about Conservatives and Tories. And he's rude about radicals as well. He can be rude about Liberals. But certainly about Tories, he's as funny and as acerbic. And I think if John Major had read it a little more thoroughly, he wouldn't have been so quick to claim him as his favourite writer. That made me laugh and laugh and laugh. I mean, I think the thing is that a lot of people think they like Trollope because they think they like this middle-of-the-road, bluff, roast beef, noisy, bearded, conservative, with a small c, if you like, Englishman, because they think that's what he is. In fact, he's infinitely more strange, more subtle, more equivocal, less obviously masculine, if you like, certainly not conservative, far better able to look into the stranger places of the soul, if you like. And it's like a very successful bluff or mask that he wore in real life, because he was himself a very insecure person and a marginalised man for much of his career. He wasn't in the centre of public life or in the centre of social life or in the centre of anything at all.
How are you able to get at that something else under it? How are you able to get at the inner man, if you like?
He gives you a clue, in a way, in that he wrote an autobiography that was very sort of structured, like any autobiography is in a way structured like a novel, if they're written by a novelist, to show very bad early beginnings. They were sort of self-help story, pulling himself up by his own bootstraps. Look how I made it, I made it, I made it. And he delineated a very black childhood. And you could say that his elder brother Tom would always say, and did say in his own memoirs, that the childhood wasn't as black as Anthony painted it, that mother was a very golden presence, that the houses weren't so falling down, that nothing was so awful. But in fact, if you perceive yourself as miserable, you are miserable. What's the difference between thinking you're miserable and being miserable? And it wasn't so miserable for the elder brother, because their mother treated Tom very much as her confidant, as her squire, as her, almost as a husband substitute when father, well, failed and then died. Whereas Anthony was always likely the left out one. So I think a child's perception of how he feels his life to be is how it is. And I think he had such an appreciation of the lonely, the unhinged, the unsuccessful, especially sort of hobbledehoy young men, graceless, in his fiction, that I do very much feel both his unhappiness as a young man and the incredible, slightly incredulous happiness of his prosperity and success later, which you could never quite believe.
You make inferences from Trollope's fiction about his life, and this is, I don't know, considered a risky business, or perhaps just not done for the biographer to do that, but you're comfortable doing that with Trollope?
I'm very comfortable doing with it. I think that Trollope is very much there on the page. He had a terrific old ego. He couldn't keep himself out of it. He gives his own opinion, not whether it's on picnics or hairstyles or crinolines, as it comes up in the story, like sort of running authorial commentary. You could say this is a kind of a device, a stance, a distancing, an ironizing. It is in a way, but he wrote himself. He wrote some biographies himself, and he wrote in his Life of Cicero that a writer always writes about what is in his mind or on his mind. I can't remember which. And I found when I was checking the months he was writing a certain piece of fiction with what was happening in his own life, that this was absolutely true. The input was extraordinary. Whatever he was anxious about in his life, whatever was going on, went straight into the fiction in a transformed form. I don't mean he just transcribed it, but he, in a way, used or diffused, both used as fuel and used as, not therapy, but to sort of work it out for himself in the fiction.
Because at one point, in writing about Trollope's relationship with his wife, about whom so very little is known, you write that I can't prove that he told Rose's wife, about his infatuation with a young American woman, nor that she reacted as I say, but, you're right, I am sure of it.
You see, this is the great difficulty with a biographer. You know so many things, and every now and then there's something you don't know. But because of, you know, the journey between A and C, you feel you know where B is too. But if you haven't got a document for it, it's very difficult to claim it. And there's various devices that biographers use, like it might well be, or she surely must, or any of these kind of phrases, which get rather boring after a while. And they're sort of cop-outs. But I was sure about this. What it was that he was very infatuated with a young American girl called Kate Field, and there had been some gossip about it, which had hurt Rose. Now that I do know. And what I feel is, from his fiction, there are these many, many, many marriages, solid bourgeois marriages, just like Rose and Trollope's, in which the wife is very, very supportive in public and just pours the tea, and the man does all the talking. I'm thinking of couples like Archdeacon Grantley and Mrs. Grantley. But in the privacy of the bedroom, the wife tells the husband what for. And bedrooms in Trollope's fiction are very bedroomy. You know, you hear about the pillows and the bolsters and the blankets and the sheets and the bedposts and the bed curtains and the night dresses and the... You sort of see them in bed or feel them in bed, almost if you're watching a movie. And the husband, rather shamefaced, sort of in his dressing room, coming back into the bedroom, not saying a lot while she goes on and on and on, you know, boring for England about whatever it is he shouldn't have done, what he shouldn't have said, and how he should tell them or he shouldn't tell them, and what she felt about it. That kind of on and on voice. In his fiction, a great deal. And also, Rose was a Yorkshire woman. I come from Yorkshire, and I know what Yorkshire people are like. They're very direct. They don't kowtow to authority in any sense, and they never let it's the sort of slightly tall poppy syndrome. They don't let anybody get above themselves. And so, for many, many reasons, and for the many, many wry asides about the way wives control husbands that I found in his fiction, I do know it. And so what was I going to do? So I thought, just cheerfully, I would say, I know this happened. I can't prove it. The reader can disagree if he or she likes, and of course you can. But to some extent you're telling a story. It's not a novel, but a biographer is a storyteller, and that is part of my story.
In a way, your entire, 500-page book addresses this question, but how was it that this loud, obstreperous kind of man was capable of such extraordinary insight into the hearts of men, and especially, as you write about, the hearts of women?
I think it came a little bit from having a hard beginning. I mean, he was a neglected and sometimes, I think, physically abused, violence, not sexually abused, child. I think that makes children very watchful and observant and beady-eyed, because you have to know, firstly, whether there's going to be any dinner, secondly, whether mum's likely to be coming back or not, thirdly, whether papa's about to bash you with the family Bible, all of which things were likely to happen to Anthony Trollope, whether the school fees had been paid, which they hadn't, whether you're going to be bullied in the playground, that he was. So it makes you very watchful and beady of other people's moods, because your survival depends on it. And he was like that. He was extraordinarily observant. And because he was rather raw in his own self and insecure in his own self, he was preternaturally sensitive to what other people thought of him. He seemed very bluff and almost bullying, but one of his sons, Harry, said to his first biographer, Michael Sadler, who was writing about Anthony Trollope in about 1923, "You have made my father," I can't remember the exact words, "you have made my father too aggressive. Few people thought more about what others thought of him than my father did. He was sort of measuring all the time, does this person despise me?" He was very insecure. He had that kind of insecurity, like a bottomless bucket, and you can pour in, glass after glass of reassurance. And it's never enough, and it's never enough, and it's always to do again. And I think he was like that, and that kind of person is very aware of other people's insecurities, and other people's needs, and other people's strategies, and little ways, and meannesses and pettinesses. He's wonderfully funny about people writing letters. His own letters in his own life were very down-to-earth and rather orthodox and dull. But his characters write these letters, and they copy them out again, and they copy them out again, because they haven't got the tone quite right. It's either a young woman trying to get a guy, or it's a woman author trying to persuade a literary editor to give her a good review, and the tone has to be just right. The person who gets the letter has to be enchanted or attracted, whatever it is. But a lot of the pleasure of Trollope are these tiny little things of shifts of behaviour and the ways in which people operate, trying to sort of get their lives under control.
One of the surprises in your book is your observation of how much violence there is in Trollope's novels. In his books there are beatings and murders and attempted rape. Did this surprise you?
I think it did, because I think the amount of violence did interest me, because I think he has such a public reputation as a documenter of middle-class drawing rooms and deaneries and cathedral closes and rather unimportant shifts of sentiment between young men and young ladies. But that was kind of like the love interest that everything had to have in every novel, as it were. You know, he said, I think in his autobiography, that there has to be love in a novel. And he tried to write one called Miss Mackenzie, where there was none, but he had to bring it in the end. He couldn't get through it without having a love interest. But the violence is often to do with jealousy, and it's often street violence, you know, people pushing each other against railings and banging heads against railings and leaving for dead, or attacks in London, small backstreet London hotels. Thuggery. I mean, we talk now about our violent society, people not being able to walk through parks at night and so on, nor could you then, in that this interests me very much. I always had believed in my heart that our own times are not really more violent than the past. It's just that it's more reported, we mind more about it, we don't take it for granted, as they did. But his characters often mugged in either Hyde Park or St James's Park, and how it was done then was by garroting, which was with a wire from behind, getting it across the throat and pulling the throat back like that, and then robbery. And gentlemen carried sticks, you know, with lead weights at the end, which were called life preservers, which sounds like some kind of life jacket. But Phineas Finn and various other of his characters carried life preservers, and I couldn't think what these were until I looked it up and found they were like these truncheons, these sticks with leaded weights to protect yourself against the muggers. So it was a violent society, and he reflected it. But I think it's one of the excitements of reading Trollope that you get the whole depth of this society and not just the drawing rooms. Don't anybody just think it's about drawing rooms.
I think, in a sense, what you convince us of is that reading Trollope is not an escape from. It's more a comment on our own times.
I think so. There's a book called, I mean, if nobody had read any, I would say read a book called The Way We Live Now, which is a title that it is about the way we live now, though it's written in the 1870s. The one thing Trollope hated and feared above all was any kind of sham, dishonesty, fraud. That was partly because his own father had been involved in not very comfortable money matters, and his father-in-law, Rose's father, had been embezzling the bank she worked for 25 years. And I think the nearness of this terrified him. And The Way We Live Now, just to mention one of his novels, is about institutionalized fraud, you know, companies and company chairmen and stocks and shares and getting money out of the public and using company money for private matters. And there's a character called Melmotte who is totally Robert Maxwell. You know, he looks like him, he sounds like him, he does what he did. And it is the way we live now. And he carries that sort of Robert Maxwell Melmotte image through all stages of life, public and private, till you get right down to the sexual betrayals and the personal pretenses in people's private lives. It's a sort of wonderful indictment of modern society.
You've written a number of biographies about dynamic, extraordinary women, but you're quoted as saying that you've never been so happy as while you were working on Trollope. Why was that?
I think partly because what makes writers most happy isn't telling other people about what they already know, but finding out about something for themselves, which they can then arrange and express and order. And I think for me it was the most marvellous learning process about somebody who was very different from me, living in a period quite different from my own, and finding the kind of constants of humanity, if you like, running through it, and the differences. And it was like a mixture of instruction and entertainment. And his novels are like a mixture of instruction and entertainment. And in a way, because biography has to be instruction, because it has to be true, I tried to make the biography a mixture of instruction and entertainment. So it all came together. It seemed like a very good thing to be doing.
Do you have any kind of, I don't know exactly, competitive spirit, but would you, at the end of the day, prefer that people now think Trollope is better than Dickens, who Trollope himself parodied and called Mr. Popular Sentiment. I mean, is there a sense that, your man, not that it's a horse race, but that your man will be on top?
Yes, there is a sense of that. There is a sense of it. I mean, I think if you've spent 4 years working on somebody and reading his work so closely, you want to stand behind his shoulder and sort of say, go for it, he's your team, go Jays go.
Well, it's a pleasure and a delight to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Well, it was wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for your hospitality.
Victoria Glendenning in Toronto. One of Glendenning's favorite books by Trollope is He Knew He Was Right. Here's a short scene. It shows the growing jealousy of Louis Trevelyan towards Colonel Osborne, who's been showing too much attention to Mrs. Trevelyan. Here's Jill Frappier with He Knew He Was Right.
It has been already said that Colonel Osborne was a bachelor, a man of fortune, a member of Parliament, and one who carried his half-century of years lightly on his shoulders. There was that little slur on his good name to which allusion has been made, but those who knew Colonel Osborne best were generally willing to declare that no harm was intended, and that the evils which arose were always to be attributed to mistaken jealousy. There was nothing fiendish in his nature. He was not a man who boasted of his conquests. He was not a ravening wolf going about seeking whom he might devour and determined to devour whatever might come in his way. But he liked that which was pleasant. And of all pleasant things, the company of a pretty, clever woman was to him the pleasantest. At this exact period of his life, no woman was so pleasantly pretty to him and so agreeably clever as Mrs. Trevelyan. When Louis Trevelyan heard on the stairs the step of the dangerous man, he got up from his chair as though he too would have gone into the drawing-room, and it would perhaps have been well had he done so. But when he reached the door of his room and had placed his hand upon the lock, he withdrew again. He told himself he withdrew because he would not allow himself to be jealous, but, in truth, he did so because he knew he could not have brought himself to be civil to the man he hated. So he sat down and took up his pen and began to cudgel his brain about the scientific article. He was intent on raising a dispute with some learned pundit about the waves of sound, but he could think of no other sound than that of the light steps of Colonel Osborne as he had gone upstairs. He put down his pen and clenched his fist, and allowed a black frown to settle upon his brow. What right had the man to come there, unasked by him, and disturb his happiness? And then this poor wife of his, who knew so little of English life, who had lived in one colony or another almost since she had been born. How was the poor girl to conduct herself properly when subjected to the arts and practised villainies of this viper? And yet, the poor girl was so stiff in her temper, had picked up such a trick of obstinacy in those tropical regions, that Louis Trevelyan felt that he did not know how to manage her. As he thought of it, and as that visit upstairs prolonged itself, he almost thought it would be best for him to be round with her. We all know what a husband means when he resolves to be round with his wife. She would be very wrathful with him. There would be a silent, enduring indignation which, as he understood well, would be infinitely worse than any torrent of words. But was he, a man, to abstain from doing that which he believed to be his duty because he was afraid of his wife's anger? Should he be deterred from saying that which he conceived it would be right that he should say, because she was stiff-necked? No. He would not apologize, but would tell her again that it was necessary, both for his happiness and for hers, that all intimacy with Colonel Osborne should be discontinued.
A scene from He Knew He Was Right by Anthony Trollope. It was read by Jill Frappier. You're listening to Writers and Company on CBC Stereo, and in the United States on the News and Information Service of Minnesota Public Radio. I'm Eleanor Wachtel. I can't exactly claim to have discovered Linda Svendsen, a 38-year-old Vancouver writer, but I did have a hand in publishing one of her short stories about 10 years ago when I was involved with a literary magazine out there. Since then, I've seen Linda Svendsen's name here and there in anthologies and associated with prizes. But now, finally, in her new collection, Marine Life, you can read a whole book of extremely well-crafted stories, sensitive and moving. And Marine Life has gotten such terrific reviews and attention that I definitely want to stake my claim. Marine Life covers familiar territory: families, step-families, divorce, awkward communications. But Linda Svendsen's observations and choice of language are striking. The stories are told through the eyes of the youngest in the family, a girl named Adele. Here now is Linda Svendsen reading Klingons.
In 1960, Mum fell for Robert Kiley and began their affair. She met him secretly at White Rock, a beach down by the United States border, where not too many people went because it was beside a railroad track, rather rocky and out of the way. She carted me along. He brought his daughter, Louise. Mum said, "She's such a dearness." Louise was my age exactly, 6. She was prettier, with a parade of faces, pink lips pressed into a shocked "oh," her furtive squirrel's glance, an expression that was above it all, eyes sideward, as if listening to a voice far off and more important. I wanted to boss her. Louise showed off her float while Robert gave pointers on mine. Whenever the current carried her away, he tugged her to him by a toe juicy red with polish. Soon she wandered back to the Hudson's Bay blanket, held her knees, and gazed out at the sea, perhaps waiting for a big, interesting wave to arrive. I saw Mum fuss, rubbing Noxzema on her. "I'm tuckered out," I said to Robert. We pretended to be Siamese cats. We meowed and rubbed up against our respective parents' legs until we started hissing at each other, hunched. Robert said, "Behave." He was still wearing his bikini trunks, and Mum snapped a lot of pictures of him with the brownie. It was my idea that Louise and I visit the railroad track and play a game. I showed her how to lie down on the wooden cross tie. I lifted my hands high over my head and pretended they were roped at the wrists. I crossed my legs at the ankles. I called, "Help!" in a soft, unworried southern accent I'd heard in a cartoon. "Help!" I said again. And she lay down, fitting as neatly as me, her wrists and ankles also invisibly bound, and we stared into each other's eyes and said, "Help! Help!" We heard the whistle. The rails, full of summer heat, shook. Neither of us budged. We just smiled bigger at each other and chirped, "Help!" I know that when my mother heard the locomotive, she instinctively checked, and when she didn't see us, tore up the slope to the track, Robert behind her. When I looked past Louise and saw an engine, big, close, the single lit eye against the day, I froze. I only remember Robert yanking my arms and my swinging up and hitting hard against his hairy chest. He knocked the wind out. The train chugged slowly by. Under the ding, 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 a man yelled, "You dummy assholes." Mum was on the other side. She hugged Louise and cradled her. "Daddy," Louise whimpered. At a picnic table, Robert turned her over his knee and spanked her until she started to choke, and Mum put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Bob." He volunteered to deal with me, but Mum delivered her usual tongue lashing. She also called me Miss Simpleton. On the way home, before we got to the lot where Mum's car was parked, we stopped for soft ice cream. Louise asked her dad to please sing the song he'd made up, and in a silly voice he went, "Every little breeze seems to whisper Louise. The boys and the trees seem to twitter Louise." She licked with her faraway look. When I asked him to make up one for me, Mum said she couldn't think of one for Adele. Then Robert started, "The farmer and the dell, the farmer and the dell," and Mum joined in, "Hey ho the dairy-o." Louise and I sat far apart and listened. Louise's mother died from lung cancer in 1967. She smoked like a fish, Robert said, and debated with my mum, whom he'd married, about attending the funeral. She didn't want him to. Then he said he'd make up his own mind and decide not to, and took a hike up Burnaby Mountain. He'd never hiked. He came home late and fell drunk out of a cab. An aunt was appointed Louise's guardian. Then there was a call. It came down to this. Louise wanted to be with her dad. On Good Friday, the night before Robert picked Louise up, I dreamed Mum died by falling into a volcano. She'd been walking bossily along, her hair in rollers under a chiffon kerchief, and then she suddenly wasn't talking. She was gone. I crawled to the edge of the cone and looked down at the beautiful sea of lava. I looked and looked. Dreamed days later, starved, when I still hadn't found her, I thought, now there's nobody to love me. I woke up with an unidentifiable ache. I wanted to call out. I wanted her to bring graham wafers and milk and sit. But I stayed in bed, eyes absorbing the night, and I glanced around the now half-empty room I was going to share. It was pouring rain when they arrived. From behind the drape, I watched her alight from the car. I could see Louise and I were no longer the same height. I was taller, the giantess of grade 7, while she was petite, frail in a paisley shirt dress, and allowed to wear fishnets. Louise appeared at the front door. As soon as our eyes met, I was intimidated and despised her slightly. She beat me to a high. Without wiping her feet, she stepped inside. That first week, the four of us did things as a team and ate big dinners. Louise seemed deaf when Mum spoke and didn't talk or look her way, but I didn't hold it against her. She may have noticed I didn't hang around her amusing father, who dubbed Louise and me Klingons after a race of ugly aliens from a warfaring planet on TV. In Chinatown one night, Louise tugged Robert's finger, and he belched, and her face exploded in a smile, suddenly like his, and I thought, we're being invaded. But farther down the block, while Robert explained the cause of a mirage, Louise interrupted to say, you know, you're tall enough to be a model, Adele, and I sort of liked her. Later in our beds in my crowded room, we talked candidly about when we'd been children. She said her father and mother had prayed on their knees before bed and had never argued. I volunteered that my real dad had had a prostate operation. Louise sat up on her elbow. Remember White Rock? Yeah. The train? I nodded. Know when my dad saved you? Yeah. I thought he loved you more than me. Really? I said, how retarded. Robert grabbed me and Mum saved you because they were so madly in love then they didn't want the other one to mope forever if their kid got killed. I sat up on my elbow too. When he heard you wanted to live here? Yeah. He cried. Really? She pondered. He was sad? No. Happy. No lie. Louise lay back down. If she remembered anything else, she didn't mention it. The next night I held a pajama party in Louise's honor and invited my 5 closest girlfriends of the month. We danced the swim to Louise's 45s. She watched the records spin and made sure my needle didn't scratch them. Nobody liked Louise, but while she brushed her teeth, I took Judith and Lynn aside and commanded them to befriend her. She emerged from the bathroom, and then they all miraculously hit it off. The sleeping bags radiated out, their 3 heads met in the center, and Louise held court. She spoke in a luxurious whisper while Penny, Gail, Caroline, and I played cribbage. Louise went upstairs again. She'd been back only a few seconds when I heard a gasp, and our group turned to look. Judith stared at something in Louise's hand, and Lynn shut her eyes. What? I said. Then louder, what? Louise covered it, like you capture a bug with your hand. You don't want to see. Show me. She made her squirrel face, hesitated, and then passed a small black and white photograph. The lady was naked above the waist. She cupped her breasts and offered them up. Her nipples were hard as penny racers. She seemed to be perched on a Queen Anne chair, identical to the one in our living room. She smiled right at me, but her eyes were deeply ashamed. It was my mum, young, from years ago. I closed my eyes, too. I thought I heard Louise say, my mother didn't die from cancer. Nobody said anything. All the oxygen in the area had been used up. My lungs couldn't find any. I think it's time to go to sleep, I said. I'm turning out the light now, and I don't think anybody better talk. The rec room was silent the rest of the night, except when one girl snuffled into her pillow, and when Robert poked his nose in and said, keep it down to a dull roar, eh? In the morning, none of us, Louise, my friends, ex-friends, or me, admitted hunger, and Robert drove one quiet contingent home, Mum the other. They didn't ask. Mum believed in letting life blow over. I did not talk to Louise. She did not converse with me. We walked to school, one slightly ahead of the other, then the one behind seizing the lead. Mrs. Rood introduced her to the class. This is Louise Kiley, Adele Nordstrom's stepsister, and suggested a tour of our exceptional facilities. I showed the new bilingual library, the nurse's cave where the nurse smoked herself gray when she wasn't off sick, and the old gym. I opened doors and let them bang shut. In her hush puppies, she followed my deafening penny loafers into the girls' changing room, the linoleum slippery with talc, the scent suffocating, the mirrors losing steam. When her back was turned, with a ferocity I'd never before experienced, I shoved her into a damp shower stall. Louise cowered against the tiles. I put my hand on the tap. My mission was to set her straight and say her mother wasn't a saint, leave my mum alone, and more than anything, to tell her about her father, the dirty jokes that embarrassed me, the yelling, the door he kicked a hole through. But I didn't speak. She was so little. She looked at my grip on the hot water faucet and started to cry. She bent at the knees and sank down to the drain next to a bit of white soap, and she was shrinking. She looked absolutely alone in the world. I sank down, too. I sat beside her, not touching. I said, "I'm sorry about your mum." We both cried silently. The buzzer rang for recess. Outside, banshees waged hopscotch and skipped. We stayed in the dark stall a while longer, then proceeded like those synchronized twins in films on hygiene to the sinks, splashed our faces, wiped them dry with a rough paper towel, and sat on a changing bench to wait. When recess was over, we went back wearing big wet spots on our dresses. Not long after, she ran away. She left the picture. I have it still. I did not see Louise again until one spring night in 1973. I came home from waitressing, pulled up behind an unfamiliar car in the driveway, and heard Robert pontificating. "Welcome, stranger," Louise said. She leaned next to her father, elbows nicking, at the table. "Come by Mum Coconut." Mum waved at me and patted the bench. I straddled it on her side. Robert poured a glass of wine and said, "Louise just landed here. She's catching us up." "I missed everybody," Louise said. "I missed Dad, having a sister, a mum." She looked apologetically at my mother. I sensed a moment between them, then Mum bit into an extremely crisp potato chip. "Sorry," she said nervously. "Loud chip." Louise smiled quickly and went on. She'd wed last summer. Felix deserted her 3 days later in a cottage on a Gulf island, and the marriage was annulled. She'd been pregnant, miscarried, then there were complications, and her tubes were tied. Her aunt disowned her. "You're like me and your dad," Mum said to her. "The school of hard knocks." "Prep school," Louise said. "Anyway, the past is water under the bridge." She got up, took a napkin from the barbecue stand, and held it against her face. Robert went and hugged her. She was still thin, a gasp for a waist, and her bangs and garden of scarlet nails grew long. It was hard to believe we were both 19, and she 3 months younger. Over Robert's shoulder, Louise said, "So, Adele, breaking hearts?" "A few," I said. "Look," she said, "tomorrow night I'm having a wing-ding, and why don't you come?" She claimed she'd invited some super nice folk. "Sounds fun," Robert said. "Maybe I'll show up, too." "We've got church," Mum reminded him. "In the morning?" "Actually, I'm working," I said. Robert seemed hurt, which Mum immediately noticed. "Go after your shift, Adele," she said. "It'll do you good. Leave us big kids alone for a night." The next night I went to Louise's after work, around 11. It was dead quiet. A swag lamp burned in the duplex window, and somebody sat on the bottom step of the cement porch. "It's you," Louise said. She was wearing a leotard top and a long skirt cut out of grandmotherly curtains. "Pull up a chair." I sat down beside her. "Where is everybody?" "Gone." She didn't appear devastated. She seemed preoccupied, depressed in a sophisticated manner, and pulled a joint out of the pouch and lit it. "Smoke?" "I've never." "Won't hurt. It'll relax you." She inhaled, held her breath, exhaled, and delicately passed it. "Here." I conscientiously puffed. Not far away, stevedore's work graveyard and boxcars bumped at the docks, dumping the guts of Canada into boats bound for Asia. She eventually spoke. "Was it nice growing up with 2 parents?" she asked. "Not really," I said. "Why?" They used to fight a lot." "Still?" "No." I didn't add that people often have to speak to each other before they can officially fight. We finished the smoke together. A sprinkler whooshed on and spun. Water sparkled in the streetlight. "Come on," she said. For some reason obscure at the time, I shed my clogs and followed her over the brush of cool grass. She walked very slowly through the arc of water, and I followed. Then she turned and walked through again, and I followed. And we did this until we noticed we were soaked and cold. One Saturday morning, Louise phoned me at the last minute to go skiing with her up at Whistler. We'd become, if not exactly friends, companions. Weekends we danced at pubs where she picked up men for both of us. Other times she dropped over to Mum's for dinner, which pleased Robert no end. Robert even popped over to Louise's to perform manly errands,
lift something, hang a picture straight. I sensed a wrong had been righted. I hadn't ever skied. She'd had lessons. I followed her down the buddy incline several times, mimicking her form, falling. Then we broke for lunch. My boots pinched. I was burned on my nose and knees, but she pushed me to try a tougher run. We caught the lift to the top. Louise lit up. "What do you think of Doris?" she asked. "Doris who?" "Doris in the choir with Dad and Mum." "Doris whose husband croaked?" Louise nodded. "Not much," I said. "Why?" "You sitting down?" she said. "She's in love with Dad." Louise hung her head back and looked at the wire bearing us up. "She wants him to move in." I was silent. For a minute I knew life without Robert.